This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Chester Brown. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this interview show, Andy and I have the pleasure of talking with Chester Brown. His new book, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, came out recently from Drawn and Quarterly, and we have a great conversation. But before we present that to you, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find discounts at 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often you can find discounts that go higher from there.
That's right. And right now, you can go to DCB Service and find a load of books from our guest today, Chester Brown. They have, I think, pretty much everything at 25 to 30% off. So
that's right.
This is a good time to load up on your Chester Brown.
Yeah, you can indulge yourself in Chester, just as we did in talking with him. And you can find those great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your Chester Brown books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And as they're waiting for those Chester Brown books to come in, Andy, they can brew a cup of coffee by getting great organic coffee from our other sponsor on this episode, and that is from Just Coffee Co-op. All their coffee is 100% fair trade, it's shade-grown and organic certified. It's roasted in small batches, no mass production whatsoever.
That's right, and you just reminded me I need to re-up.
Okay.
On my Just Coffee Co-op. I just ran out on Friday. But if you go to justcoffee.coop and you place an order for your coffee, tea, chocolates, or what have you, you can enter the promo code COMICS and get a 10% discount on your order.
That's right. You can't go wrong with justcoffee.coop. Using our coupon code to get 10% off, it's a wonderful way to get caffeinated.
That's right.
This was a sheer pleasure talking with Chester Brown. This is one of those creators that I'm glad we got on the show. I feel that it's a real get for us. But I was a little intimidated because, I love Chester's work, and he's one of my heroes in comics. And I thought, oh, my God, we're going to be talking with him. I hope we don't screw it up.
Yeah, this was a real, if I had a kind of bucket list of creators I want to interview on the show, Chester Brown's right at the top.
Yeah. We had a great conversation. He's very personable, and I spent most of our time talking about his new book, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus.
Yeah, and we got into some interesting stuff, so I hope our listeners, as they get into this, enjoy listening to it as much as we enjoyed participating in it.
We're pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Chester Brown. His new book, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, was released last month from Drawn and Quarterly. Chester, thank you for being on the show.
You're welcome, Derek.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome, Andy.
Chester, you just recently finished up a tour for this book, or maybe it was the first leg of the tour for this book. And when you and I were corresponding the other month, you said that it might be good to do the interview after you do some of the tour, and you may have some interesting stories. So let's start there. Do you have any stories to tell us about the reception of Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus?
I don't know that there are good stories. Things certainly happened on the tour, but so far the reaction has been very positive. I know when I went out to tour, paying for it, I was worried that I might get heckled at an event like one of these sorts of events, and that never happened. It did kind of happen. Was it last week for the Toronto event here? There was. It wasn't actually. I didn't get heckled, but during the Q&A thing, at the end, there was a guy who asked why I had chosen to pervert these stories. And, I gave my answer, which was basically that I didn't think I was perverting them. And I apologized if he saw it that way, but I was just interpreting the material. And then he said, what did he say? Could you answer the question? As if I hadn't answered it. I think one of the people on stage with me jumped in and said something like she didn't think that I perverted the material either, or something like that. And then it was easy to cut the person off because his question was supposed to be the last question for the evening. And I said, thanks to everyone for coming out. And everyone stood up at that point. So it wasn't that awkward, but that's the closest thing to something like that's happened. Everything else has been very positive. Lots of people apparently liking the book, and actually, in the last place I was in was Washington D.C., and there was a young woman who was super enthusiastic about the book. Her reaction was probably the most intense and excited that I've encountered so far on this tour. She couldn't stop hugging me and just said over and over how much she loves the book, and very enthusiastic. So that's the sort of reaction you like.
That's great. You sort of answered my question a little bit, because one of the things I was curious about is how the response you've been getting compared to the response from paying for it. And I've just been rereading the collection of interviews with you that came out from University of Mississippi Press a few years ago, and the sense I get from the interviews with paying for it is that they seem less about the book itself and more about the politics behind the book.
Right.
And are you finding anything like that with this book?
I guess so. I mean, there's much more talk about religion and the ideas behind the book, and to some degree the politics, and not as much focus on things like drawing and storytelling technique and that sort of thing. And that's what you expect. But I'm trying to think. I guess the you get some of that too. But it's so far the reaction has been, as if one is to go by the reviews that I've read, it's been more favorable than was the case with paying for it. Although, in the major media, paying for it was very well reviewed. But I don't know if there's been a real slam of Mary Wept so far. Some mildly negative stuff, but I think there was I would say a mixed review on Tits and Sass, the sex worker rights website. And the Hooded Utilitarian had a review that kind of questioned my scholarship.
They will do that. I was also wondering along those lines too. I mean, one of the things that happened when I was reading the book is something that really kind of clicked for me with the way I had been kind of raised in terms of Christianity and why it didn't work for me. That a lot of things you said kind of clicked as to, well, this I can see as the appeal, especially when you talk about getting rid of the idea of kind of there being these rules and laws that everybody has to follow, and the real message is one of love. That kind of clicked for me. And so what in opposite maybe to the political would be the reactions of people who are just kind of, and maybe this was with that girl you were describing, that they want to kind of see you as a I don't know, religious figure yourself, or something that would want to kind of confess how they feel about religion and how that is your book has impacted that.
I don't think, well, maybe that particular young woman, but I'm not getting the sense that most people are considering me any sort of religious figure.
Yeah, that was probably a poor choice of words, but in thinking about it too, all along kind of your body of work, there's you haven't shied away from kind of confessional personal stories of your own. And does that in any way maybe open the door to readers to kind of feel like they already have a connection with you when they meet you?
That could be, I guess. It's hard for me. Well, I don't, when, I do signings at conventions, and I'm usually seated beside, at the Drawn and Quarterly table beside someone like Seth or Adrian Tomine or someone like that. And I don't get the sense that people are reacting to their work any differently than they are to mine. Everyone's excited to meet the person behind a work that you enjoyed. So, yeah, it seems about the same.
Okay.
Now, guys, it strikes me, we're talking about Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, and I know that this is a book that Andy and I have mentioned on our podcast in the past, but we haven't gotten into a discussion of it yet. But there may be many of our listeners out there who is not familiar with the premise or the setup of Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus. So, Chester, if you were going to describe this briefly to those who want to go pick it up, or even those who may not want to go pick it up, how would you describe this?
Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus is a series of it's adaptations of a series of biblical stories. They mostly center around prostitution, but there's also a sub-theme relating to the question of religious obedience. But the main theme that deals with prostitution is actually, even though there are stories from the Hebrew scriptures, the ideas mostly center around the question of what Jesus believed in relation to prostitution. With my belief being that most Christians think that Jesus was tolerant of prostitution, or that he accepted prostitutes if they repented. It's popularly seen that Mary Magdalene was a repentant prostitute, and therefore Jesus forgave her and accepted her as one of his followers. But my belief is that Jesus went further than that. That he didn't merely tolerate prostitution or accept one if one repented of one's whoring ways, but that he actually saw prostitution as a good thing for society, that it benefited society.
Mm-hmm. And then you have stories in here. You cover or you adapt the Tamar story, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and then Mary, and in fact Mary of Bethany. But another thing that you pointed out is it's not just an adaptation of parts of the Hebrew Scriptures where you, and even the New Testament, where you have prostitutes involved, but there's another message. And it's that other message that after I finished reading this book helped me to make a lot more sense, along with your notes, they went a long way as well, of course, of why you included an adaptation of Cain and Abel and the talents. And then I think the last part is the Matthew bit and the prodigal son, yeah. And that, I think, outside of a larger context, if you're only looking for, I guess, the prostitute angle, one may think, why are those there? But if you're looking for the underlying message of love and not necessarily following the letter of the law, then those other bits do figure in quite well with what you've done with the Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth sections.
Yeah. I think the only chapter that doesn't actually relate in some way to prostitution is the first one, the Cain and Abel story. All the others touch in it, I think, in some way. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. There is that sub theme that in which I try to explain why I think Jesus did not favor following a set of rules. Particularly in his case, it would have been the laws of Moses. But he would have been against any sort of religious laws, whether they were based on what's in the Torah, or whether they would be based on the letters of Paul or whatever.
Now you also talk about in the book this genealogy of Mary that Matthew includes, that, if I'm remembering right, none of the other gospel writers included. Was kind of seeing that and trying to decipher why that was there also a part of the genesis of this book?
Yeah, definitely. The book there are probably two genesis points for the book, and that one was the first one. Although I should mention that Luke has a genealogy too for Jesus in his gospel, but his genealogy is different, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't mention any women in his. Right. I hadn't been thinking about the genealogies for Jesus at all until I read a book titled The Illegitimacy of Jesus by a biblical scholar named Jane Shaberg. And I would have read this book back in the late 80s, I guess. And Shaberg had this theory that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had been a rape victim, and that Jesus had been born as a result of that rape, and that Jesus was therefore illegitimate. And part of her argument related to the genealogy that's in Matthew, in which, as you mentioned, 5 women are listed. Tamar, Rahab, Bathsheba, Ruth, and finally Mary. And so Jane Shaberg's contention was that the first four women in the genealogy are there to comment on the fifth. In other words, the presence of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba was supposed to indicate that Mary had been raped. And for a while, I bought that theory. It seemed reasonable to me. But at a certain point, I rethought it, and I realized, why are those four women supposed to indicate that Mary was raped? Perhaps Bathsheba was raped, but the other three definitely had not been, at least in the way that their stories are told in the Bible. So I rethought that theory. It seemed to me that something else was going on there. And looking at those four women, it did seem like they were linked in one way, which was that they were all involved in some form of sexual impropriety. Tamar and Rahab had both been prostitutes. Ruth had been involved in premarital sex, and Bathsheba adultery. And so it seemed to me that if those women were indeed there to comment on Mary, the comment was that, and they were supposed to relate in some way, it seemed to me that what was being said was that Mary was in some way involved in some form of sexual impropriety, probably prostitution.
Well, let me ask you about some of the research that you've done for this book, because someone picking this up will find that your afterword and notes take up about a third of the text. And as if that's not impressive enough, I have to hand it to you. You write out all of the notes and the afterword. My God, that seems it would have taken longer than doing the comic itself.
Yeah, it's all hand lettered, except there were some last minute corrections that the book's editor, Tracy Hearn, had to do at the Drawn and Quarterly office. I would have wanted to re-letter those corrections, but it was last minute stuff just as the book was going to press. So maybe there are 20 words in there that I didn't actually hand letter. Tracy, I guess, had to create a Chester Brown font to match the rest of the lettering. But all the rest of the book is hand lettered.
Well, the lettering's impressive, but the fact that you did all of the reading and research for this is quite impressive as well. But, as you mentioned, this is not as if you're just starting to do this stuff in preparation for the book, because you've been fascinated by these topics, these kind of biblical stories for quite a while. I mean, you mentioned the book, The Illegitimate Jesus?
The Illegitimacy of Jesus.
The Illegitimacy of Jesus, that you read that back in the 1980s. And so we're aware of your early adaptations of the books of Mark and then Matthew. How does your earlier work in comics, or your even personal interest that predates your work in professional comics, when it comes to the Old and New Testaments, play into Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus? That interest. That's why I did the book. I hadn't, after paying for it, I had no idea that my next book was going to be, again, in any way related to prostitution, and I didn't know that it would have a connection to the Bible. I thought I was doing a completely different book, and then this one just kind of popped out of the blue. I happened to be reading a book about the parables of Jesus just for my own entertainment and interest. And I found something in there that triggered an idea. And suddenly the result was me doing this book. But yeah, I've just been fascinated with this topic, well, I guess all my adult life. All my adult life, say. In my early 20s,
I started reading books of biblical scholarship and just found the topic really fascinating, and couldn't stop reading those sorts of books, and that fascination has continued. And so me wanting to do adaptations of Mark and Matthew, that grew out of my desire to understand what was going on in those texts.
Okay.
Speaking of kind of that, the period of coming up with this book, in the notes you talk about how you were starting out. You started out with the idea for a mini comic, and it just kind of kept growing. Could you talk a little bit about your interest in actually doing something like a mini comic, following paying for it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, occasionally I do these little mini comics just for fun and to, some of it's just to experiment with new drawing techniques or whatever, and to do little adaptations of works I find interesting, or just, I don't know, just little things for fun that, I aren't, significant enough for a book, and that I would give to like family or friends or whatever. So I was reading that book, The Power of Parable, and I came across the author of the book, John Dominic Crossan, was talking about the parable of the talents, and he mentioned an alternate version of this parable that was in a lost gospel, a gospel that no longer exists, but that is referred to by some of the early church fathers. And so this Christian historian named Eusebius, who lived in the 3rd century, mentioned that there was this alternate version of the parable of the talents. He gave a brief summary of it, and I'd never heard of this alternate version of the parable. And reading it, I became very interested, and Crossan gave an interpretation of what he thought was going on in that alternate version of the parable, and I disagreed with his interpretation. Had a different interpretation, and decided I wanted to do an adaptation of the story to present, my idea, my interpretation in comics form. And so originally I was just going to do it as a mini comic. But then when I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that the story was very similar to another one of Jesus's parables, the parable of the prodigal son. So I thought, it would be a good idea to do adaptations of both of those stories so that the connections between the stories would be obvious. And then as I was thinking that, I suddenly remembered that theory that had grown out of reading Jane Shabrig's The Illegitimacy of Jesus, the stories about Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba that I thought indicated that the Virgin Mary had been a prostitute. And so suddenly I wanted to... all these stories seemed to connect in my mind, and I decided to do a book that dealt with all of these stories. And then other stories got connected too. Other stories got added, but that was the beginning of the book. I wrote a script very quickly after that, in about 2 or 3 weeks, and not long after that began drawing the book.
since you brought up the parable of talents, could you explain how your version of that parable is different from the one in the New Testament?
Sure. In the New Testament, there's a story about a slave owner who owns 3 slaves, and he decides to go away on a trip. And he, before he goes, he calls the 3 slaves to him, and he says, I'm going away on this trip. I'm going to leave all my money with you guys to look after while I'm away, and take good care of this money, and I'll see you later. And he goes off, and 2 of the slaves, and now this is the biblical version. In the Bible, 2 of the slaves invest the money and double the amount, and one of the slaves takes the amount that he was given, the amount of money, and the money is called talents. A talent was a large amount of money. So so the 3rd slave takes the money that he was given and buries it in the ground, and because he's worried that he'll lose the money if he does something like invest it. So he wants to make sure it's safe. So when the master returns, the 2 slaves who have invested the money and doubled it, say to the master, we doubled your money and here it is back. You gave us a certain amount and we're giving you much more in here on your return. And the 3rd slave, he was given only 1 talent, and he dug it up before the master got back, and so he says to the master, you gave me 1 talent, I'm returning 1 talent to you. And the master had been very happy with the slaves who invested the money and had rewarded them, but with the slave who didn't invest it, who returned the same amount that he was given, he was very unhappy with that slave, and he punishes him and puts him in prison. So that's the way it was told in the Bible. In the story, the way I think it was told in the alternate version that Eusebius recorded, once again, the 3 slaves are given these amounts of money, but and one of them does invest the money and double it, and one of them does bury the money in the ground so that nothing happens with the money. But another of the slaves takes the money and spends it all on prostitutes. And so when the master returns, once again, he punishes the slave who buried the talent and, didn't increase the amount that he was given. And with the slave who invested the money, he seems somewhat disappointed and kind of, unhappy, but, doesn't punish that slave. And with the slave who spent the money on prostitutes, that slave he's very happy with and embraces. And I have the master freeing that slave, which isn't in the description as Eusebius tells it. As Eusebius tells it, the slave is just embraced. But Eusebius just gave a summary of the parable, and I think that perhaps in the way that Jesus told it, he was actually freed, but I can't prove that part of it.
One of the reasons I just asked is, first of all, I like your version better, but also, I don't know if Derek experiences this in Texas, but I'm in South Carolina, and we're coming up here on graduation season. And I often get politicians giving graduation speeches who, use the parable of the talents as, their message to students as they go out into the world. And I keep feeling like, this isn't about investment capital.
Right.
Yeah,
And so I wonder how much they would use it if it was about go out and blow your talents on hookers.
right. Yeah, I've also heard that interpretation that you have, that in which people argue that Jesus would have been in favor of modern capitalism, which as I personally am a libertarian, I have nothing against capitalism, but I don't think Jesus would have favored capitalism as we have it today. Everything in the Bible that I see has Jesus having a very negative view of wealth and wealth accumulation.
Right.
That interpretation of the parable does not make sense to me in relation to Jesus's other beliefs regarding money.
Yeah. And Andy, I've yet to hear a speaker at a commencement ceremony mention the talents, although when I worked as an editor, I worked on a number of books. The press used to do a lot of business books, and we would invariably, unfortunately, have these kind of, self-improvement, motivational speaker type texts that had a Christian slant to it. And invariably there would be the talents used as an example of how to invest your funds. So that would annoy me.
Yes.
The last graduation speaker I saw use it was actually our illustrious former governor Mark Sanford, who you may know. I don't know if you know the story, Chester, about how he got caught up in a sex scandal. So.
Oh, okay.
But it wasn't with a prostitute. That would have been very appropriate.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's too bad. Could have made a better story if he didn't.
Well, Chester, you've been mentioning the stories in Mary Wept in terms of adaptations of biblical text, and I'm wondering how much you've heard this during, let's say, the tour that you've just been on, or even reading in the reviews, a comparison between Mary Wept and what Robert Crumb did in Genesis.
Yes. Some people, I haven't seen too much of that, but the book has been compared to Crumb's Genesis. The usually people are saying that they like my book better, and I see that as a bit unfortunate because I love what Crumb did with Genesis. I think his book is amazing. He put it together with such intelligence and care, and the artwork in it is amazing. I mean, it's so beautiful. Mm-hmm. I think it's my favorite book by Crumb, and I'm a big Crumb fan. I love everything he does. I like that people like my book, but maybe. Yeah, it's just unfortunate if it's used to put down Crumb's book or detract from what Crumb accomplished. I don't see why we have to play one off against the other.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of examples of biblical adaptations in comics, but it just seems to me that Crumb's Genesis would immediately leap to a lot of people's mind, especially since Crumb did the intro to paying for it. So there's that connection as well. And also, you said in a number of places about the influence and how much you appreciate the work of Crumb, as you just said now. The thing that strikes me is the difference between the two. And even though I can see people making that comparison, I don't really necessarily see that as a viable link, is that and correct me if I'm wrong here, but every adaptation is an interpretation to some degree or another.
Oh, of course.
With Crumb's Genesis, though, I think he attempted as best as he could to do a straight out, let's say, true to the original text, but again, that's open to interpretation, adaptation of Genesis, or as quote unquote true as he could get it. In the stories with Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, you're not necessarily trying to go with an actual quote-unquote true representation of a particular biblical text, but you're doing an overt interpretation, as you point out in the notes. So, I mean, and the story of the talents is just one example, but, there are other places as well where you're telling the story in a particular way, but you're not just doing it for the hell of it, giving your own spin that has no foundation whatsoever. You use the note section to point out how you feel that this interpretation makes the most sense to you. And it may be unfamiliar to readers of, the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah. Well, that is very much what's going on. Crumb was trying to keep interpretation to a minimum, or he was trying as much as he could to present the stories the way that he would have thought the original tellers intended the stories to be told. And I'm much more interpreting from, shall I say, a personal point of view. I mean, I am trying to get at the original meanings of the story, but I'm doing that in a much more free way, I guess, than Crumb did. So yeah, I'm more overt in what I'm doing from an interpretive perspective.
Now, you do call attention to Crumb's Genesis at one point in your notes, right? When you're talking about the story of Tamar and how your interpretation of how she would dress when she becomes a prostitute is different than what Crumb drew, right?
Yeah, Crumb had Tamar, going out dressed supposedly to attract clients, or to attract men to her for the purpose of having sex for money with them. Actually, she was trying to get one particular guy to have sex for money with her. But anyways, so she presumably would have been dressed as a prostitute, but Crumb has her completely covered up, head to toe, with only her eyes and hands showing. And it did not seem to me that that's the way that a prostitute would have dressed to attract attention. So in my version of the story, I have her dressed in a much more revealing way. Perhaps I go overboard. I don't know. But I think that at least she would have exposed her hair. The hair was at that time, hair was seen as a very erotic thing for men. Of course, now we're used to seeing women display their hair freely, but it wasn't as common at that time. So a woman displaying her hair in public would have been seen as making herself, available to men for the purposes of prostitution.
Just to kind of follow up on what Derek was saying, when I read that note about the difference, that kind of drove me back to Crumb's Genesis, which I hadn't looked at in a while, and then I just went down that rabbit hole for the better part of a day that I didn't necessarily have time for, but enjoyed doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That must have. Well, I always enjoy looking at that book.
Yeah.
I'm wondering as well if, you'd mentioned a while ago, Chester, that when you finished paying for it, you didn't know that your next book would have to do with prostitution, much less have to do with biblical texts. It's just the way that things evolved. I'm curious if you feel that your career as a whole can be seen as a series of stages. And the reason why I'm asking this is a few years ago, I was teaching a course, and as one of the assignments, I was encouraging students to pick a comic or a graphic novel, whatever they wanted to call it, and use it as the basis of the assignment. And this is not long after Paying for It was published, and on their own, a couple of different students in that class, because I said, research and, find something that may be up your alley, and most of them weren't familiar with comics. They didn't read them. Definitely not on a regular basis outside of one or two in class. And I had two different students come back and they discovered Paying for It. They did not know who you were. They did not know your previous work. This was, I think, the only graphic novel that they had read, if maybe ever, and they were excited about it. Okay, so I'm thinking for those guys, they're coming to Chester Brown for the first time, and they loved Paying for It. They hear that he has a new book coming out, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, and they're looking at Mary Wept and Paying for It, and they're thinking, okay, so here's a guy whose comics is all about sexuality and prostitution, and maybe with a religious spin to it, and they may think of you in that way. I mean, how different would that be if they went back to look at those early issues of Yummy for your very early comics from the 1980s and see, not only how the Happy Clown stuff was, but the more autobiographical comics? So again, getting back to my original point, do you see your career as kind of progressing in a way that you have periods where you focus on a particular kind of narrative for a time and then move on to kind of another particular kind of narrative approach?
Well, I've always just followed my muse. I do see that people who maybe haven't been following my career from the beginning don't really have a grasp on the whole of it. I remember experiencing this particularly during the Louis Riel period, and people's perception of me at that time. And it seemed like everyone was seeing me as Mr. Canadian History. And I was getting all these offers from magazines to do illustrations that related to Canadian history in some way. And all the interviews, revolved around Canadian history and whatnot. And I was very, I was looking forward to Paying for It coming out and kind of destroying that image. Because I don't know. It's not that I have anything against Canadian history, but I'm no raving nationalist or anything.
Well, you talked about Canadian politics in Paying for It.
Oh, sure. I'm interested in politics, that's for sure.
Now, you mentioned Louis Riel. Now, that is, correct me if I'm wrong, the last time that you serialized a longer narrative. And I'm wondering about your decision after Riel not to do that anymore and what went into that.
Sales for the floppy issues were just going down. I wasn't even sure that the money we would get from the serialization of the Louis Riel issues would justify releasing them in a serialized form. But Chris Oliveros, my publisher at that time, thought even if the sales wouldn't be great, that it would still bring in some money, and I would need some money to live on while I created the book. So he convinced me to go with serializing it. I hadn't really wanted to serialize it because I was picturing Louis Riel as a book, and I had structured it that way with the 4 sections, the way it is now in the book. And I didn't like the idea of it, cut up into 10 sections instead of those 4. But Chris won me over with his arguments, and so yeah, we serialized it. But I'm kind of glad that serialization is over now. It's I like bringing these works out as books, and I think paying for it had more of an impact because it came out all at once in that form, rather than being seen slowly in dribs and drabs over the course of however many years it took me to work on it.
Mm-hmm. Was Chris behind the reissue of Ed the Happy Clown in the early 2000s?
Yes, he was very eager to see that work back in print. I was less eager. I'm not that crazy about my 2 earliest books, Ed the Happy Clown and the Playboy. I was saying, why don't we just let those books go out of print, and we don't have to. We don't have to have them in print perpetually, do we? But he I don't know. He likes my work or something. So he was actually quite concerned that there had never been a hardcover edition of Ed the Happy Clown. There had been the 2 paperback editions that had been printed by my first publisher, Vortex. Mm-hmm. But both of those had been printed on pretty cheap paper, and I guess he thought the presentation should be, for those books, should have been better. And so he wanted a version out there that reflected how he thought the material should be presented. So he dragged me into it. He wouldn't take no for an answer.
So that's why we had that original 9-issue reissue, I guess, but from 2004, 2006, something like that, and then the book, the graphic novel, in 2012.
Yeah.
So and I know you may not think very highly of Ed the Happy Clown. I love it because, if nothing else, it's a wild ride. There's a lot of weird, funky stuff that goes on, and I especially appreciate it after having read Brian Evanson's study of that, Ed versus Yummy Fur, which I thought that was a perfect volume to start off Tom Kaczynski's critical cartoon series for Uncivilized, in trying to take on this almost unwieldy story of Ed the Happy Clown, and how you had changed it, how you had wrestled with it, how you were unsure about it, and then how we have the final book, and then how that's so different from what we find in the original Yummy Fur issues.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting having your work examined in that way by someone. Brian had an interesting approach to the subject, and I don't know if I've properly thanked him for writing the book, but it was an interesting take on it.
Actually, in talking about serialization too, I thought of that while reading Mary Wept at the Feet of Jesus, that because of the short nature, this could have been conceivably serialized, but then it wouldn't have the kind of cumulative effect of kind of building this thesis right across all these stories.
Yeah, I think it works better as a book than it would if it had been serialized. I hadn't even really been wondering. Because it was. I was planning to bring it out as a book all along, and the days of serialization seem to be long behind us now.
Yeah, there are not many people who do that anymore. I think one of the only holdouts is Adrian Tomine.
Yes, Adrian still does that. Is still attached to that form, and actually, Seth is still serializing Palookaville, although his Palookaville collections are book size now. He is still serializing longer pieces in there, but there are there's a lot more attention to, I guess, or a lot more cartoonists, bringing out graphic novels all at once rather than serializing them first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Jason Lutz is still doing Berlin, right?
Oh, that's right, Berlin.
That's coming close to wrapping up.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, are you working on something now, Chester? Do you have any idea, even vaguely, what the next longer project is going to be for you?
I've got 4 ideas, and I'm not sure which of them I'm going to go with. I will say that at the moment I'm absolutely enthralled with that big Kaz book that came out, the book of his
Underworld.
All of his Underworld strips. I love that book. He's got such a beautiful drawing style, and it's pretty funny too. And it's got me wondering, do I want to do something more like that, something kind of goofy and maybe more humor oriented, or that's a possibility, but I'm not sure. It's entirely. It could be that I do something biblical again, because the Bible's still on my mind. So that's a possibility too. But yeah, I've got 4 specific ideas in mind.
Well, maybe you could do goofy stories about the Bible. Kind of combine some of those impulses.
Yeah, maybe.
It'll be like little kids or some kind of like Muppet Babies type of narrative, but telling biblical stories.
Maybe.
One question I had left on Mary Wept at the Feet of Jesus, as in terms of the production of it, you've talked about a lot in the past, that the method you do for drawing, where you draw a single panel at a time on a single sheet of paper and then rearrange them. Is that still the way you're working with something like this?
Oh yeah. That's the way I've been working for almost all my adult life. Early on, I was trying to draw the traditional way, where you take one large sheet of Bristol board or paper, and you draw all of the panels that are going to be on a page on that sheet of Bristol board. And I found that when I was reaching up on my drawing board to draw the drawings at the top of the board, my arm would get tired, and I preferred drawing the panels at the bottom of the board that were closest to me, because I wasn't having to extend my arm as far. And I was like, why don't I just draw like maybe the final 2 panels on each page, or draw like a tier, like 2 panels at once, and then arrange them, stack them as pages afterward. And then I was like, well, why even do that? Why not just draw 1 panel at a time? And that way, if I can edit a story, if I want to take something out or put something in, it's easy to edit and rearrange pages if I'm just drawing 1 panel at a time. And so I've pretty much done that since my early 20s. There have been maybe 1 or 2 pieces that I haven't done that way. Did you guys see that the covers I did for the Penguin edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are comic strips on the front and back, and for some reason, both of those I drew all on one page. Not even sure why I did them that way, but that was kind of an anomaly. Yeah.
So what's the scale like? Because when I got Mary Wept at the Feet of Jesus in the mail, I was kind of surprised by the
size,
the production design and so on of it, and in kind of looking at the long vertical panels that you're using. I was just curious as to what's the scale with the panels as you draw them compared to what we get on the page.
The panels are quite a bit larger. I should actually measure because I'm getting asked this question, but I think they would each have been about 7 inches tall, the original versions. So I don't know what the reduction is there, maybe a 20 or 30% reduction. But yeah, I wanted the book to be small. I like a small book. Mm-hmm. And I actually wanted the book to be even smaller. I was originally intending it to be like, the old mass market trade paperback or paperback size. But at that size, the panels would have been, even smaller. And I was showing them around to various friends, and everyone was complaining that, no, those are too small, printed at that size. So, I chose this slightly larger size, and I'm pretty happy with the result.
It still fits in the pocket easily.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
Depends on how big your pocket is, I guess. Well, on the topic of the size of your panels, Chester, one of the things that I noticed between the Mary Wept proper and then what we find in the notes with the story of Job is that, you're dealing with a different size panel, which has me curious. Did you draw the Job story after, during, or perhaps before you started to illustrate what we have in Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus?
It would have been after. I actually did the artwork for the main comic section of Mary Wept pretty quickly. I began in April of 2014, and I finished drawing it pencils and inks at, I think, in January of the next year, January 2015. And Job was done several months later, maybe around September of 2015. So, it was later. And I felt like, I don't know, I was feeling differently. I just wanted to try a different approach.
Well, will you be going to TCAF in a couple of weeks?
Yes, I will be.
That should, I've never been to TCAF. I know that's something that Andy and I discussed last year on the podcast was Dustin Harbin's Diary Comics, and one of his last bits is of meeting you and Seth at a TCAF.
Right.
And it was a very moving experience for him, and it becomes almost a religious experience for him, the way that he draws it.
Right. I saw that. I love Dustin's stuff. He's got a gorgeous drawing style, and those diary comics were very interesting and well done. I wish he was putting out more stuff. He's a really good cartoonist. I remember that dinner with him and enjoyed hanging out with him.
Well, I hope you enjoy TCAF this year, but I very much thank you. Andy and I thank you for being on the Comics Alternative. We had a great time talking with you about Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus and other stuff as well.
Oh, thank you guys. Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, thanks. So that was a fun and interesting conversation, and I'm glad we got into both kind of the philosophy behind Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, but we also, towards the end there, we're also getting into some technical questions about the creation and composition of the book.
Right, yeah. Chester is not only a generous creator to talk with, but also a very thoughtful one. I really appreciated what he was telling us about the origins of this project and many of the issues, text-based issues, and the research that went into his afterword and notes. Because I have to say, as much as I loved the comics in Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, I think I'm even more impressed by those extensive notes and the afterword, because you have notes that are that allude to parts of the comics themselves, but then you have notes for notes.
Right. I found myself having to use 3 separate bookmarks to read.
I did too, yes. and so reading this became a labyrinthine experience, but in a good way.
Yeah, I love that. And that's one of the things I like about his other books too, where especially something like, Paying for It, where he reprints it, reissues a new edition of it, and then there's notes upon notes upon notes in that as well.
Yeah. And, this is, I think, a characteristic of Brown's, because we can see even in his early comics from Yummy Fur, there was one story that he began, just a short story after Ed the Happy Clown, and it was Helder. It was someone who who lived in a boarding house that he was in.
Helder and Showing Helder.
And then the Showing Helder, right? The Showing Helder is a comic about his creating the comic Helder and the reaction that he was getting from that. And that's not that dissimilar from the kind of things we see Chester doing with the notes and in the afterword of not only Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, but also Paying for It.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Showing Helder is one of my favorite of his works, and we didn't get around to talking about that, but we did talk a lot about Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus.
Right.
And when we when we concluded, I told an anecdote that I was a little embarrassed to bring up on the air, but since we did talk about it, I feel like I mentioned that I had the experience when I first read the Playboy. I was coming back from a conference, and I was reading it in the airport, and the Playboy being about Chester Brown's fascination with Playboy magazine as an adolescent. A family sat down at the table across from me, and I had to kind of pull the book in really close so that the kids weren't exposed to what I was reading. But that actually sparked an anecdote from Chester that I think you caught some of, right?
Yeah, and in fact, you're right. When we cut off the recording, you had mentioned that, and you were asking me if that was my experience, if I had told you that reading Mary Wept recently in the airport, I had some kind of weird reaction or embarrassing reaction from. But that was Gilbert Hernandez, right? In Blubber, not Mary Wept. But then, then I thought, oh my God, this would have been perfect for the interview. And then I was able to turn the recorder back on when Chester was sharing with us something that happened with him about an interview that was conducted in an airport. So I'm going to go back and listen to that to see if I caught enough of that to justify putting that in at the tail end of this episode, kind of as an extra added bonus.
Yeah, that would be good. I hope there's enough of that.
Yeah. So, if you normally cut off this podcast episode, our podcast episodes, as our outro music is going on, then don't do it this time. Make sure you let that play through, and you'll probably find a little nugget of Chester Brown goodness at the end.
Yeah. And if you don't, I feel bad for making you sit through everything, though. I like our theme song.
Yeah, it is cool. We had a good time talking with Chester. Thanks to him, and also thanks to his friends Sukyen and Adam for allowing him to use their computer that had Skype on it. That's where he was recording from. So thanks to those guys. And if you want to find great comics that Chester has put out, then you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. As Andy pointed out at the top of the show, you can find almost all of his books there at 20 to 30% off of the cover price, including his most recent Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus. That's 30% off. You can't beat those deals. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about this interview. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a recorded message through SpeakPipe, which is very easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way on the telephone. That number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, and Pinterest. We also have a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. And you can also find us on Spotify now. But you can find every single one of our episodes as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. And we do like to hear from you. We'd especially like your reaction to our talk with Chester today.
Yes.
Yeah. So until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.
Was it last week? I was doing an interview with someone from Vice magazine in an airport, and they were asking these quite explicit questions about my relationships with sex workers and my ongoing relationship with this one sex worker I've been seeing for 13 years. And so here I am talking about, paying for sex in this crowded, waiting room in this airport with all these people around me. It was a bit awkward.
Well, that would have been a great part of the interview. I'm sorry. I'd bring it up earlier.
It was. Actually, when you said that, Andy, I turned the recorder back on right at the tail end. So,
okay.
Yeah, but it was probably too late to edit that in.
We could have it as a post music after the credit sequence.
Yeah, do you mind if we do that, Chester?
No, that's fine.
Okay.